The Cornelius, Oregon Church of Christ welcomes you. We continue our lessons on sins of the mouth, gossip, with Brian Haines in the book of James. We look at gossip, storytelling, or malevolent speech, delivered on January 25th, 2026.
The last few weeks, we have been in the book of James, and we've been talking about how it is that the book of James addresses the way that we live as Christians. And that perhaps one of the most critical ways that we demonstrate that we are of the people of Christ is the way we talk. James has a lot to say about that. And we've kind of used this statement here in James 1 and verse 26 to be a critical statement about how it is that we are to live our lives. James says, if anyone among you thinks he's religious and doesn't bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. James talks a lot about what we can do with our tongue. And I only list here some of the things that he says that we do that are wrong with our tongue, but he also talks about a lot of the things that we do that are right with our tongue, and how it is that we can praise God, and how it is that we can confess God, and such the like. But James really wants us to be understanding that our tongue, as he says in James chapter 3, it can be a very dangerous thing if we don't keep it in control. And so for the last few weeks, we've been talking about different ways that we don't control our tongues, whether it's blasphemy or vulgarity. And this morning, we're going to talk about something that James mentions in James chapter 4 and verse 11, when he's talking about how it is that we talk about each other. He says, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. Kind of an interesting statement. Do not speak evil of one another. It's pretty broad, but it's a conversation that's held all throughout the scriptures, time and time again, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, about how it is that we talk about one another. Because we do talk about one another, sometimes in a very positive way, sometimes in a very concerned way, but the Word of God also acknowledges that sometimes we talk about each other in a way that we ought not to talk about each other. There's a passage back in the book of Proverbs I've always thought is particularly interesting, in Proverbs chapter 6. And the writer here, we assume to be Solomon, says there are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him. And I've always caught this passage, it's always caught my interest, because it's almost as though he's saying, you know what particularly upsets God? And you got to be careful to say, I think he's being more poetic than literal. But he says, you know what particularly bothers God? You know what God is really upset by? Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among his brothers. It's kind of interesting. He talks about, the eyes, the hands, the feet, the heart. But a lot of these, half of these things are about the way we talk, whether it's lying or bearing false witness. You can even make the case, and next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll talk about the danger of being a boastful speaker. But he talks about, in this last point, somebody who spreads strife among brothers. There's a special word that we like to use to describe the idea of talking about somebody to a degree where we are spreading strife about others. And the word we like to use is the word gossip. Gossip. Gossip's kind of an interesting word because, believe it or not, it's not a word that really has a great straightforward definition in the Bible. In fact, it's not even used as often as you might think. There are translations like the King James Version. I don't think the word is found at all, but the New King James, it's not used too often. New American Standard uses it a few times, English, NIV. So you find some translations that use it more than others, but it's not as common as you might think. Instead, when we think of gossip, and even sometimes when the Bible when it does rarely use that word gossip, it's actually talking about a whole slew, a whole type of conversation, not just one thing, but a number of different things. Sometimes we describe gossip, we say, well, gossip is talking about people, but that's not accurate. That really doesn't catch the idea of what gossip is, because there's a lot of examples in the Bible about people talking about each other. Paul writes us letters where he talks about other people like Apollos or Barnabas or Timothy. or vice versa. Gossip has to be understood so that we appreciate the idea of the danger that it promotes to us. So let's pause for a second and say this. What are some of the words that the Bible uses? I'm going to just throw some words at here, pulling from the typically from the New King James. I'll throw some different terms. In the Old Testament, you have a term called a backbiter. A backbiter. In Psalm 15, verses 1, 2, and 3, there's an example there where he talks about a backbiter. You think of what a backbiter is, and I think it's probably a term that we can guess that it's the idea that while somebody isn't looking, maybe we use the term, you're stabbing him in the back. That you're wounding somebody when they don't know that you're doing it. Slanderer. Slander is an interesting word. Slander is the idea of lying to destroy somebody's reputation, and that's a word that falls into this language of gossip. A talebearer. A talebearer. A talebearer is kind of interesting because it's the idea that I'm telling something, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm gonna say it. A whisperer. It's kind of interesting in these languages that use this word whisperer, and it's not just in the Old Testament, the New Testament, Greek language also uses the word whisperer. The word itself is kind of a thing. The idea of something we want to say, we want to kind of keep secret. We don't want other people to know that we're saying it. In Romans chapter 1, as Paul is talking about the sins that men degrade themselves into, and he talks about things like murder and sexual sins and such. And then he talks a lot about the way we talk being a sign of how it is that we become people that have turned away from God. He uses, in fact, two of the terms that found in the Old Testament. He talks about whisperers and backbiters in Romans chapter 1. There's another word that comes up, busybody. Busybody. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 11 warns us all of the danger of becoming busybodies. And busybody is a term that speaks to the idea of people that just want to talk. And they just want to share things about others and not in a way that's positive or edifying. They love, and maybe in some ways we could say this is the most common definition of the word gossip. They love the juicy tidbits to talk about. A meddler. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 15 describes the idea of somebody who's always in the affairs of others and talking about other people and you could say, all up in somebody else's business. A tattler. That was a kind of an interesting one. Tattler. You grew up in school and the teacher would tell you, don't be a tattletale. Kind of ironic. I used to say, but wait a second, don't you want people to tell you if something's going wrong? And the idea, of course, is that a tattler is somebody who is doing it because they want somebody else to be in trouble. It speaks entirely to the idea of the motivation of why we do it. What is gossip? I remember years ago in a Bible class, we were talking about gossip, and somebody said, well, gossip is saying things that are not true. And it's certainly the case that there is a gossip, a type of gossip. One of those words we use, the word slander, speaks to the idea of saying something that's not true. Indeed, we would say that Jesus in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 59 was the victim of slander when they were looking for false witnesses that would bring him to a criminal conviction. So they slandered Jesus. Kind of interesting, by the way, the idea of slander is, I know it's not true, I'm going to say it. Let me suggest you, tale-bearing is, I don't know if it's true or not, and I don't really care. Sometimes somebody will forward me a message, an email, and maybe it's a political message, and I think, well, did you look to find out if this is true? And well, I don't need to know because if it's not true, it should be true. Talebearing. I heard a story, so I pick it up and I carry it and I bring it to somebody else. I don't look at this to find out if it's true or not. And that's a type of lying. Even if it's not your intention to be deceitful, you're delivering a lie from one person to another. And if you haven't gone to the effort to find out if it's true or not, then you're really bearing a guilt of deception yourself. So gossip includes lying. Lying is one of the things that the book of James warns us about, not to lie, not to be people that speak untruth or people that are dishonest. But what's interesting about gossip is that, by and large, usually it's true. That's an interesting thing to think about for a moment, that the idea is that gossip can be something that's true. And I think for a lot of people, they say, well, wait a second, how can it be evil? How can it still be evil when it could be something true? Why is gossip evil if not because it's false? Think about that for a second. That's the question. How can gossip be such an evil thing? Something that God says there are 7 things I hate, and this is one of them. But I'm telling you that gossip doesn't have to be false. I want you to appreciate that this is where we come to the core of all the different words that we use for gossip. Here's where we say this is why God hates it. Because number one, at the root of this is an evil desire. An evil desire to wrong somebody else. Number two, God hates it because he said, I can't stand the way we talk about others. It is a disobedience towards God. So let's kind of dwell on this for just a few moments, and I want you to think about this because obviously we're going to say, how do we apply this to ourselves? And obviously this is the kind of thing that all of us are going to get a little uncomfortable with, right? I do. I know you do too. And we should get uncomfortable to think about how it is that we talk about people. And that there is a fine line between a conversation we might have about somebody where it is Paul might be talking about Peter in Galatians chapter 2, and he talks about something that Peter had done that was wrong, and how it is that sometimes, it's talking about people isn't what the issue is. The issue is, what is your intention? What is your intention? I would say this, at the core of the evil of gossip is that our intention is to make somebody listening think less of somebody else. That's the core concept about gossip. We want you to think less of somebody else. And if you understand that, you can see why, whether it's true or not, may not be the most critical thing. I just want you to think less of somebody. Now that might be putting others down for the sake of our own being elevated, for my own pride. It's a terrible thing that there are times where we want other people to look bad so that we can feel good about ourselves. That's pretty common, right? Hopefully every one of us appreciates the idea that it is a natural temptation to say, I'd like you to think less of this person as da 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 da, so that you feel a little better about me. I know, Ramon and I have talked about this in preacher training, that a lot of times it's easy to fall into a category where you like to talk about how bad other preachers are. We don't do that, right, Ramon? But you do it because you want to feel better about yourself. But that's true of everybody. We do it as parents, we do it as employees, we do it as husbands or wives, and we say, well, I want to talk bad about somebody else so that I can feel a little better about myself. We bring them down, and we want to put them down. And like I said, it might be so that others think less of them. It could even just be so we think less of them. But at the heart of gossip is an idea where we want others to seem worse. We might go on to say that any conversation where the point of it isn't about love is suspect. You know what I mean by that? In other words, if I can't genuinely say that the conversation I'm going to have, and let me tell you this, when Paul talks about Peter in Galatians 2, and he says Peter did something he shouldn't have done, Paul's coming from a place of love when he rebukes Peter. He's coming from a place where he wants it understood that for us, anybody can stumble, even Peter stumbled, but we make it right. But if I'm not coming from a place of love, and I got to pause for a second, because a lot of times when people gossip, they say, well, I'm coming from a place of love. Well, you're probably lying to yourself. You have to truly see where and understand why it is that you're having the conversation you're having about bringing up somebody else. Because it is so easy to lie to yourself. I've always said when in Jeremiah makes the statement in Jeremiah 17, Jeremiah says that your heart is deceitful above all things. I'll say it again so you hear what I said. Jeremiah says that the heart is deceitful above all things. Jeremiah is not saying that we're just, the heart is just an evil thing naturally. What he's saying is that when you lie to yourself, you're always going to believe it because you trust yourself more than anything else. So if you're not careful about lying to yourself, you'll always get tricked. Common thing. I think probably a lot of us can appreciate that we've seen that many times in life. Gossip is about an evil intention, first and foremost. And of course, as I said, secondly, it's also about a concept of a disobedience to God. God said, here's how I want you to talk to people. Brian, if you see somebody doing something wrong, there's a way to handle that. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. If he doesn't listen to you, take one or two more with you so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. I'm reading past verse 15 here. Let's just stop here at verse 15, though. If God said, hey, if you see somebody do something wrong, the right way to handle this is go talk to that person. I can tell you how many times somebody will say, oh, Brian, I saw something do something wrong. Hey, did you go talk to him? No, I'm telling you. I may not be the person you need to be telling. Now you might be asking for advice, or there might be a sincere reason that doesn't make it gossip, but carefully speaking, do you know what God told you to do? God said, go talk to that person. Is there any reason why you're not doing that that isn't sinful? Might need to ask that. Talk to that person. Don't talk to me. Don't talk to others. Talk to that person. This is what God said to do. This is what God told us is his will. So you can see right away that gossip is a big deviation from what God wants us to be doing. Think of it like this, Colossians 3:13, bear with one another, forgive one another. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Number two, you have a complaint about somebody. What is God's number one rule about that? Let it go. I don't like the way this brother does this, or this sister said that, or what is God's declaration on this? Let it go. I think Matthew 18 ties back to that. If they're in sin, you need to talk to them. But if it's not a sin, some of you are getting excited for some of the sports that are coming up. I'm not a sports person, so I've got to be careful not to even pretend I am. But somebody says something bad about your team, let it go, because you know it's not a sin. There's a lot of times where people insult us and they don't, it's not a sin. They were being unjudicious with their words or their terms or whatever it might be. And the Bible says, Ryan, you need to let it go. That's the way we're supposed to handle some of these things. As I said, if it's not a sin, I need to let it go. And maybe I might go so far as to say, if I still can't let it go, then I have to go talk to them about it. But that's God's command. Sounding a lot like what James said in James chapter 4, Paul says in Romans chapter 14, why do you judge your brother? Why do you regard, he says, or again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? Gossip is at its core a disobedience to God, because if somebody's sinning, you're charged to go talk to them about it. And number two, if somebody has quit sinning, you don't talk about it, you forgive them. And if it's not a sin, you, and can I say it with emphasis, you don't judge that. These are the commandments of God. So you can see why God says gossip is a big deal, because gossip is breaking these rules that God gives us. Gossip. Let's make it personal, shall we? As I said, we would come to that point. You knew we were going to come to that point. The question you ask yourself is this. Are you, and we sometimes use the word gossip as a person, are you a gossip? Are you? We want to say to ourselves, well, I'm not a gossip, Brian, but brother so-and-so over here is. So it's easy to slip into this. I've done it myself. It's easy to stumble on this one, and we have to be aware of that. God's people struggle with this. That's why James wrote so much about the mouth. That's why Paul was talking to the Corinthians, because they had some problems. They were saying some stuff about Paul. And Paul was trying to rebuke them to get them to correct themselves. He says, I'm afraid that perhaps when I come, I may find you not to be what I wish, and may be found by you not to be what you wish, that perhaps there will be strife, jealousy, angry tempers, disputes, slanders, gossip, arrogance, disturbance. I kind of like this passage because he's talking about a lot of things that kind of fall into this words problem. Paul says, one of the things I worry about with the congregation in Corinth is that you've got a lot of problems about the way you talk about people. God's people do struggle with this. Why do we struggle with it? Well, I think on a large part, a lot of times we're having conversations that we haven't really thought about. We don't understand what God's rule is. Go back to the idea that I've had people tell me, well, if it's true, it can't be gossip. That's not true now, right? You know that something can be true and still be gossip. It can be the case that somebody did something and your obligation is to talk to that person, but you instead tell everybody else you're now guilty of gossip. It might have been true, but God said, if it's true and it's a sin, here's what you do. And I didn't do that. As we've said, gossip is about intention. And sometimes we say, well, if it's true, it's not gossip. That's just not the case. Gossip is that intention. As I said, perhaps we just say at the core, the intention to lower our feelings about somebody else. I've heard people say, well, Brian, it's my job to warn other people about the dangers that this person can have. I acknowledge that there's a little bit of truth to that sometimes. When John wrote in 3 John, he was writing to his friend Gaius, and he says, you got to watch out for Diotrephes. You have to watch out for him because he seeks preeminence. That was a little bit of a warning. But John also said, and I'm going to talk to Diotrephes about that. My job to warn others. It's kind of interesting in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 7, he talks about love and he says, love seeks the best of things. There's just a lot of times where we take on that job to be the person that's telling everybody else about the dangers that somebody presents, and we have totally left love behind. Jesus would rebuke the church of Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2 for the fact that while they did great things to confront false teachings and false doctrines, that they had left their first love. Sometimes people say, well, I am just venting. And I think sometimes there's a place for that. Let me be careful to say, I think somebody says, I'm just really upset. This brother said something to me. I'm really upset about it. Okay, but what next? Are you just saying, are you really just letting this out? Or are you actually, deep down, is there a part of you that wants to make me think less of them? And it becomes gossip. And let me be careful to say this. It's easy to lie to yourself and say, no, I'm just saying this because I just need to get it out. I think that's fair. I think it's okay that from sometimes we might say, I just need to get this out and say it and hear myself say it out loud. But I think we also deceive ourselves because there's a part of us maybe that's saying, but I want you to think less of them. I can always tell when somebody's venting or not, because it's whether or not they're willing to have me say, well, you know what you need to do, go talk to them. And they say, yeah, I know, I'm going to go do that. Well, I think they're just venting. And if they say, nope, I'm not going to do that, here's why I won't, then I know it's not. Will you accept my observation about what you're feeling right now? You're mad at that person. That person has done something that upset you, but I don't think they did anything wrong. I think maybe you did something wrong. Are you willing to hear that? Then it's venting. And if you're not, then I'm pretty sure you're gossiping. People gossip at the heart because they have let's call it a sin-sick heart. It's diseased. It has this ailment. And what makes it feel better? Putting down others. That's what it's about. It makes us feel better to put others down because while we're not raising ourselves up, we're dropping them, and it's kind of like we are raising ourselves up a little bit. It makes us feel better. There's a lot of times where people are meddlers or talebearers, or, this idea of being the person that wants to share things with others. We don't even care if it's true or not, because we love this idea of being in the know, to having that little bit of information that nobody else had and telling them and shocking them or surprising them and feeling important for a moment. It's pride. It's arrogance. Sometimes we like it because, again, it just deflects from our own problems, and it makes other people what we hope is to feel a little bit about us. It can be pretty tough to get this under control because as I said, a lot of times we're not willing to acknowledge within ourselves when we've crossed that line and when we've gone too far. And that's why bridling the tongue on this one might be one of the hardest ones. Last two things we talked about, blasphemy or profanity, kind of black and white. You can see when you've done it and you know what you should and shouldn't say. This one is the one that even people that have been Christians for 30 years slip up in because they can't always see it. And they can't always look at themselves and have that conversation of, what is my intention here? It's so deceptive when we do it. And so it's remarkable to me that, kind of to finish up our thoughts, that James says, again in James chapter 3 and verse 2, we stumble a lot. Let me just pause for a second and say this. I like this statement, we stumble in many ways. James is not saying, hey, you guys, you've got to be perfect. We've said this before. God isn't saying, I expect perfection. He says, I expect diligence. And James is acknowledging, we stumble, but maybe where you want to put the greatest effort towards your spiritual walk, getting your mouth under control. If anyone doesn't stumble in what he says, he's perfect, able to bridle the whole body as well. Do you believe that? Because this is the word of God that says it. Gossip's a big deal. It's easy to fall into it. It's about the intentions of our heart. And a lot of times we think that makes us less susceptible because we can control that. But I am telling you this morning, that makes it so much more difficult because it's so easy to lie to ourselves. Let's take a second. Let's go to our Father in a word of prayer. Would you join me? Most holy God and Father in heaven, we're so grateful to have a few minutes of time to come together today and to think about how it is that we walk by faith and glorify you. And this morning, Father, we've talked about a hard subject, a subject that probably a lot of us struggle with, Father. It's one about how we talk about others. And Father, it's so easy for us to slip into a conversation or make a statement about somebody else and not have the right attitude and the right frame, the right intentions. Father, forgive us of this sin that we commit. Help us to be aware of our own intentions and not to deceive ourselves. Help us to talk about one another in love and in compassion and mercy and forgiveness. Help us to forgive wrongs, Father, that oftentimes may not even be evil, just the way we walk and live with each other, Father. We can hurt each other's feelings. Help us to have a great love. Help us to have the kind of love for one another that you have for each of us, a love that overlooks so many of our faults. Help us, Father, to have the strength to talk to those that are doing wrong, to have a love for them that wants them to do what's right. Father, we're grateful for this opportunity we've had today to talk about these things. We pray, Father, in this week we'll have opportunities to be tested so that we can grow ourselves and apply ourselves in this truth. And it's in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus we pray. Amen. Been kind of finishing up this series of lessons with Romans chapter 10 and verse 9, which talks about that thing we do with our mouth that leads us towards salvation. Here in Romans chapter 10, Paul said, you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus. He says, you believe in your heart God was raised from the dead, you will be saved. He goes on to say, with the mouth, confessions made, with the heart, belief unto salvation, meaning it leads you there. It was a journey that begins by hearing the word of God and believing it. Then you make that confession. Then you believe with your heart. Then you turn away from sin, which is repentance. and then you're baptized into Jesus Christ. You die to sin, you're buried with him, you arise in a newness of life. This is the word of God and what God calls a person to do in order to be saved. And what we do with our mouth is important to that, both in that process of becoming a child of God by confessing Christ, by turning away from sin, by being baptized, and in the process of living as a child of God. Whether we glorify God with our prayers and with our songs and with the message of truth, or whether we're working hard on bridling our tongue. Every time we come together, we offer an opportunity for anybody who wants to become a child of God. There's a chance here now that if you know what you need to do and you're ready to do it, we'd love to talk to you about that. We also, though, offer the opportunity that if somebody here this morning struggles and you've got some kind of burden that you're struggling with as you bear, we'd love to talk to you about that. We'd love to see what we can do. Maybe we can pray about it. Maybe we can do more than pray. Maybe there's something you need that we can help with. If that describes you, we'd like to talk to you about it. Anything I've said convicts you and you want to do something right now, why don't you come up here and visit with me while we stand and sing a song to encourage.
Thank you for joining the Church of Christ in Cornelius, Oregon. We can be found on our website. You can scan the QR code on your screen or the CD you were given, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Cornelius Church of Christ. Thank you and God bless.